Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 6th of our RTPI London Idea Exchanges. And this week we're part of the Plan Alive Online, which is the RTPI's alternative planning convention for 2020, which hopefully a lot of you will have been attending events this week. Please do get involved on Twitter using the hashtag #PlanAliveOnline. And just to note before we start, if you take a look at the handout section on your control panel, you can find links to a lot of the RTPI's work relating to this session in a downloadable PDF. And that will also be available if you're watching a recording of this session at rtpi.org.uk/planalive. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please use the submit box if you've got anything you'd like to ask that strikes you as we go through the presentations. We'll now go through our speakers. So the Idea Exchange is really focused on some of the issues emerging from the COVID-19 crisis, and I think one of the big things that has been really clear is the fact that it's exposed such deep inequalities in London and other cities. So today we're going to explore with our panelists some of the ways that planning and the role that local government can play in creating more balanced growth and inclusive economies to do that. So with us today we have Chris Paddock, who many of you in London will know as an industry leader. He's now Director of Place and Economy at PRD and has been doing a lot of work recently advising organisations on post-COVID-19 recovery. We've got Nabeel Khan, who's Director of Enterprise Jobs and Skills Sustainable Growth and Opportunity Directorate at the London Borough of Lambeth. So Lambeth obviously been at the forefront of a lot of the inner London COVID response, and Nabeel's been leading the council's economic response to that, including getting businesses back up and running this weekend, ready for Super Saturday, as I believe they're calling it. And we've also got Sarah Atkinson, who many of you know as the Community Relations Manager from the Royal Docks. Again, an area that's subject to massive regeneration and a need for inclusive growth. Sarah also brings a great background in civic participation, including work internationally with NGOs in at least 3 continents around the world. I'll also say we were meant to be joined by Dr. Saffron Woodcraft, who's sadly unable to join us for personal reasons today, but Chris will touch on some of what she's going to talk about, particularly around the London Prosperity Board. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris, and then we'll go through our presentations. And as I said, please submit questions as we go through, and we'll have a good debate at the end.
Every meeting, I start talking before I mute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Paddock. As Tom just said in his introduction, I am Director of Place Economy at a small consultancy called PRD, and we advise local authorities on economic strategy. We also work with developers and investors to help them with their strategy and delivery as well. And subsequently, we're working for both the public and the private sector in helping them formulate their response to COVID-19, to recovery, and also thinking about the type of economy, the types of places that they want to support and operate in the future. I'm going to talk generally about inclusive economy and what I think that means and where I think that needs to take us over the next 5 minutes. I'm going to reflect particularly on the borough of Newham, where Sarah is also focused, because our organisation is working quite fundamentally with the borough of Newham at the moment, thinking about their recovery and reorientation strategy. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is just the scale of the situation that we find ourselves in. It's easy to say this is an unprecedented crisis, this is a different type of recession, but the potential impacts of it are fundamental. Focusing on Newham briefly, at the moment in Newham, you've got 102,000 people who are either on benefit and looking for work, are on furlough by their employers, or are in self-employment furlough. So there are 102,000 people, that's about 45% of the entire working age population, who are either out of work or at risk of being out of work. So in terms of planning for that, we could conceivably have a situation where 30, 40, 50,000 people are out of work in Newham come September, November, December time, and that's completely unprecedented, and it's happening now. It's happening already. It's not a case of waiting for the furlough to happen. The claimant count rate in Newham between February and May increased by 190%. So it's it increased from about 4,000 to 10,000 people. So really significant change already happening, but certainly come September, even more significant. And we know from the research that the type of recession that we're going to have in the coming years will be a recession that has much more significant impact on the poorest, those in or living closest to poverty, than the last recession had. The last recession was actually a recession that directly impacted more on the middle classes. It was the government's response that then impacted on the poor and those in poverty. This will directly impact upon those furthest from the labour market or in uncertain employment. So we need to think differently about the economy, and I'll say it now and I will say it later, and I may even go off on a rant about it at some point. The government's response is not right, and it's not good enough, and it's not deep enough. The idea that we will build a load of things and eventually some people will get jobs and get back into employment is not going to pass muster as far as I'm concerned. However, there are lots of interesting examples of good things that we can draw upon, and I think if we do think differently about the economy, then there is an opportunity to create something better, more foundational, more interesting, and more impactful. So I think the fundamental thing to take away from this, if you take away nothing else, is the difference between inclusive growth and inclusive economy. People often use the two interchangeably, certainly in our line of work, but they're actually quite fundamentally different. Inclusive growth and good growth relies upon the economy to grow for you then to generate additional value that you can then redistribute or in some cases pre-distribute to address any imbalances. Now we're going into a situation where the economy probably won't grow for a number of years. So I think just this idea that you can grow your way out of this recession is a bit of a fallacy. And so it actually makes more of more sense to focus on the idea of inclusive economy, and that is about building a fairer economy from the grassroots and from the bottom up. And that's not to say you don't want external investment, you don't want economic growth, because of course you do, but your strategies perhaps focus more on participation, they focus more on democracy, they focus more on the needs of individuals and their prosperity and the security of their livelihoods as a more fundamental. Now, to do that, I think the first thing that we need to do as an industry, as a collective, as a society, is actually rethink what we think of as a successful economy. So at the moment, economic success is very growth focused, and that's, as I say, it's kind of fine. You want your economy to grow, and you want more jobs, and you want better jobs, and you want jobs that pay more money. However, if you go to the Treasury and look at the way they measure economic success, they do it really in two ways. If you look at the Treasury Green Book, they look at productivity, which is the focus of the LEPs, and they look at land value uplift, which is kind of the measure that they use to make decisions which impact upon our work. Now, they're kind of quite odd measures when you think about it, because productivity is a long way divorced from people's individual day-to-day economic prosperity, and land value uplift is effectively an extraction from an economy. So I think we're better off if we think about economic success in terms of well-being, in terms of happiness, in terms of individual security and individual prosperity. And that's one of the things that certainly in our work with Newham, our work with other boroughs, and our work with developers we're talking about at the moment. You know, if the economy isn't growing, then surely it is better to focus on people's well-being and people's happiness. And this isn't a new thing. New Zealand abandoned GDP as a measure of economic success last year in favour of a focus on the happiness index. Amsterdam as a city has adopted the principles of donut economics, where its first objective is to enable a minimum standard of sort of social welfare for everyone. Seoul in South Korea has done the same. Bologna in Italy has built an entire sort of planning and placemaking system around the idea of the urban commons and collectivism and involvement in decision making with a very nicely titled Office of Civic Imagination. So these things are already happening in cities around the world, and I think certainly should be something that London should consider. Obviously, we're hoping to have Saffron with us today. So Saffron runs something at UCL called the Institute of Global Prosperity, and that oversees something called the London Prosperity Board, which does research around prosperity in very specific local areas in parts of London which are changing very significantly. So they're doing research basically in estates around the Olympic Park, around the Royal Docks, and around Euston and King's Cross. And their work is supported by a number of organisations, including our own. And what they do is, rather than focusing on are people getting into jobs, what skills have they got, they focus on a broader range of measures: belonging and identity, health and well-being, opportunity and aspiration, power of voice and democracy. And they train local people to do research, citizen scientists to go out and do research as part of a 10-year longitudinal study about people in probably more deprived areas' experience of change within London, and helping us to understand how they feel about their own prosperity, their own inclusion, in response to the changes that are going on around them. So that's been going for a couple of years now, and I would encourage everyone to go and look at the London Prosperity Board website, because from that research comes really good insight into the experience of younger people, the experience of people experiencing social isolation, etc. So that's a really positive articulation, practical example of what I'm talking about in terms of inclusive economy. And I know Nabeel and Sarah will talk more about that as we go forward. I think I'll leave it there because I'm conscious that other people need to speak. But looking forward to questions and discussion at the end of the session.
Fantastic, thanks, Chris. That's really thought-provoking stuff. I'll hand on to Nabeel now, who will talk a little bit more about what Lambeth is in the London Borough are doing around inclusive recovery.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, as Tom said, I'm Nabeel Khan. Under normal times, I'm the Director of Enterprise Jobs and Skills at Lambeth. But during the emergency response, like many of you, I'm sure, my role changed slightly, and I was tasked with leading the council's economic response to COVID. Can I just say how difficult it is to follow a visionary like Chris? Honestly, I fear you're going to get rather more prosaic musings from me. But on a serious note, a lot of what Chris has just talked about resonates quite strongly. Without wishing to resort to platitudes, as a local authority, we really have been on the economic front line during these past few months. Lambeth made the local economy one of the three key pillars of our response work streams, alongside our work on the food and care packages hub and our public health angle, of course. Our chief exec and the leader of Lambeth Council told me and the team that they wanted us to move fast, break things if necessary, iterate and learn, which gave us real agency actually to operate in a way that was truly sort of cross-borough in our approach. So in the interest of time, I won't list everything we did during the emergency response, but I'll just give you a sense of some of the things we managed to get done during the initial sort of weeks post-lockdown. I mean, one of the first things we did was form a Lambeth Business Task Force, where we're quite fortunate in Lambeth that we have 7 business improvement districts in the borough. They know their patches, they know their business space, they know the local economy far better than I do, far better than my team do. And we wanted to bring them into the conversation really and give them a voice at the table in terms of designing what immediate interventions would be important. And that sort of partnership approach really sort of paid off. And I'll come on to our recovery efforts in a minute, but they have really been sort of part and parcel of our collective response from day dot really. So that was one of the first things we did, bring them around to the table. We applied 3-month rent relief to all tenants on our estate. So on all our sort of council buildings and land holdings across the borough, we applied a blanket 3-month rent relief. That benefited about 320 odd businesses. Now, by the way, these businesses tend to be your more sort of SME micro businesses. The exact type of businesses that, as Chris was referring to earlier, they're not in the sort of glitzy high tech sectors of creative or tech. They tend to be sort of servicing local communities, and we felt it was really important that we help protect them through the sort of lockdown period. So by granting them a 3-month rent relief, it was quite a brave decision for the council, because it did mean that we had to absorb the costs. And let's be honest, the council's financial position isn't particularly great at the moment because of the funding gaps we're facing as a result of our response to COVID. But it was something that our members were really keen to do. But perhaps more importantly, what that allowed us to do was have a conversation with other landlords in the borough. So by doing this ourselves, we were then able to go and talk to other public sector landowners first, so the likes of TfL, the likes of Network Rail, Arch Company, and say to them, what can we do collectively? And as I'm sure you all saw, they followed suit and applied 3-month rent relief for their tenants as well. And then as a result of that, I was able to have a conversation with some of our private sector landlords, and in terms of what they could offer some of our business tenants. Now, it wasn't, they weren't always able to offer rent relief. They weren't always able to offer rent deferral. They weren't always able to offer sort of rent restructuring or payments. But I can tell you, because I was involved in those discussions, they were doing everything they could within their gift to be a bit more flexible towards their tenants. And it was difficult for some of our landlords as well, because they had their lenders sort of requirements to meet. So that was So what started off as a sort of in-house initiative by us actually allowed us to have much more collaborative discussions across the borough with our landlords. So it was really, it was twofold, really, the importance of that. We of course dispersed nearly about £60 million worth of grants to businesses, and we did it in a timely fashion. I think that's the most important thing. We got money out of the door. We resourced up our business rates teams. We sort of pulled people off other work and really got our systems in place so that we could get money out of the door as quickly as possible. Speed was the key. We set up a local economy hardship fund, because there were quite a few gaps in some of the government measures that were announced in March, April. So in between the sort of self-employment scheme, in between the job retention scheme, in between the loan schemes the government announced, there were some gaps that we had sort of locally noticed. So for example, our culture and creative sector, hugely important to Lambeth, they weren't really getting the type of support they needed. For example, there was this arbitrary sort of rateable value threshold of 51k that government put on the grants, which meant that actually in London it became a real problem, because quite a few businesses in London, they were higher than the 51k threshold, but they weren't eligible for any of the grants. So what we did was we set up a local economy hardship fund. We used our neighbourhood community infrastructure levy. Partly we used the discretionary grant that government gave us a couple of months into the crisis, and we formed a £4 million fund, which then targeted specifically our arts and culture at risk organisations, our independent hospitality and retail businesses. And I think that went down really well with our business space, because again, it showed them that we understood the severity of the situation and that we were able to think creatively and use existing resources in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have done pre-COVID. On a macro level, we spoke with our top 25 investors in the borough, those that have a development pipeline, and we wanted to do two things really with them. So we reached out to all of them pretty much soon after lockdown, and we wanted to get a sense of where their plans were. So were they still bringing forward their developments? And also we wanted to reassure them that our planning system was still open for business. So we didn't move our planners onto other sort of emergency work that required redeployment of staff resourcing. We wanted to keep our planning system open. We wanted to keep our discussions ongoing. We wanted to keep our PPA agreements in place. We wanted to really sort of give that sense of confidence to investors and our developers that look, this place is still open for business. So I think that was, again, that went down really well with our sort of developer forum, because it sort of showed them that we were thinking not only of the sort of micro stuff, the impact on the local high street and our small business space, but also we were thinking about the strategic stuff in terms of our recovery efforts and where we were going to have to go next. So what next on recovery? Well, we're currently finalizing our economic recovery strategy. We're hoping to publish something in the next week. We've been quite focused in identifying what the key actions are for us in the short term. And I think it's really key to sort of bear that in mind, really. The recovery strategy that we're going to publish is going to be an agile strategy. It's not going to be a 50, 60-page document that local authorities, including me, by the way, love to specialize in. It's going to be a short, sharp, agile strategy with a view that in 3 months' time, we will revisit it, and depending on the economic outlook at the time, we will pivot as needed. So really, the focus on the sort of next 3 months and the short and the immediate actions are going to be the priority for us. And needless to say, that in the short term, it will be the need to stabilize the economy and support the survival of businesses and jobs. And Chris painted a rather grim picture of what's happening in Newham at the moment and what's going to be happening in the next couple of months. And it's the same in Lambeth. We're expecting about 30,000 people to be unemployed by the end of summer, which to put that in context for you, pre-COVID, we had 9,000 people unemployed in the borough. So, it's just the scale is something that we haven't seen since the mid-80s. And the sort of response that we're going to have to put in place is something that we've never done as a sort of local authority before, and we will play a big role in that sort of recovery efforts, because no matter what government do at national level, no matter what the Chancellor announces next week as part of his summer settlement, the local authority and sort of the voluntary community sector and other locally focused providers are going to have a huge role to play in actually plugging the gaps, because quite frankly, DWP are just not resourced enough to sort of deal with the upcoming mass unemployment that we're about to witness. So I'd just like to end on just one point, really, and this is to play devil's advocate. If I could just play devil's advocate for a moment and offer some thoughts in defence of inclusive growth, as Chris was putting it. And this is again just me playing devil's advocate. I mean, as a local authority, we've seen a 60% reduction in our budgets during the last decade. During that period, we've become ever more reliant on council tax, business rates, income, and other sort of income streams. My entire team, as it happens, is entirely funded by Section 106 or SIL income. So my counter provocation to Chris, I suppose, is the growth element for us is really important, because actually it helps us fund a lot of our critical care services that, quite frankly, if we relied on the government grant purely, we wouldn't be able to do. So our children's services, our adult social care services, our libraries functions, all of those are net spenders, if I can put it that way. Whereas the work that my team and the wider Sustainable Growth and Opportunity Director at Lambeth do is bringing in that income, bringing in that investment into the borough, which not only does it sort of help the economy, but actually on a more sort of parochial level, it plugs some of our financial gaps. So I'll just end with that thought, because it's a counter provocation to what Chris set out.
That's great, thank you, Nabeel. If we can hold that thought for the Q&A at the end, we'll just come on to Sarah, who's going to talk a bit more about what's happening in Newham. Okay. And you've got a presentation, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to show a few slides to start with, so you know where we're talking about. You might know a bit more now that City Hall is consulting to move to the Royal Docks. I'm on the wrong one. Yeah, the Royal Docks in Newham, London's only enterprise zone, also meeting with the opportunity area. And that means that there's a massive investment and loads of projected growth to happen here. We're talking about 4 kilometres of dock water, tons of public realm, 220 hectares of GLA publicly owned land, and housing and job growth. And I think this is what Nabeel has set up as the provocation of the necessity of growth in order to plug gaps in primary service delivery. I think this is one of the challenges that the Royal Docks area is dealing with. As an enterprise zone, it's supposed to be an engine for the UK and the London economy. It's also within Newham, one of the most diverse but also deprived boroughs in the country, with a very strong agenda for community wealth building, which the Mayor of Newham is prioritising as part of an inclusive economy strategy across everything that they do. There was a delivery plan submitted and delivered in 2018, and at that point it had various strategies attached to it, but there wasn't a communities strategy. And I work as a community relations officer in post since about October, so that's mainly what I've been working on. Because as we started seeing over the past 2 years, as the team was working and building relationships locally, regionally, nationally and internationally, actually, because the scale of investment in this place is so huge, and to achieve the ambitions of inclusive economy and community wealth building and retaining local investment and local economic development that the Mayor of Newham is so focused on, realised that the enablers for this and are what Chris was talking about at the beginning: democratic participation, the strengthening of civil society, in order to balance and try and achieve that inward investment coupled with local economic growth and inclusive growth. So yeah, working on developing a community strategy has also kind of become the driver for the way that the Royal Docks is positioning itself as a place. But actually, maybe I'll just come off the slides a second because you don't really need to see them. That was just to show you, yeah. So the proposition of the place is being framed as a purpose-driven investment, to invite investment in that is socially and environmentally aware. So there should be a clear ethos based on good growth. So shareholder value is not the sole growth compass, and that plays in again to this discussion around reframing what value is, and also with a long-term aspiration to influence the improvement of the local ecosystem, to be part of the community, to be part of the neighbourhood. And the way we're trying to do that is through a development of a community strategy, which will be built in partnership with stakeholders and also with communities. Actually, can I share a slide again? Because I'll just show you kind of a draft of what that might mean in practice. So I think I need to wait for the little pop-up. Thank you. Yeah, let's see if that gives me a slideshow. Sorry. See, this is the problem with using slides. It becomes very boring. That one. So the community strategy, and the bits I want to focus on are the pieces that I started helping to develop with local communities that really come from a background in civil participation and international development and human rights work, which is quite interesting to see how important that is becoming in responding to the current context in the UK. These approaches have been used in many other countries for many other years, but even developing the success framework, which Chris and PRD have also been working on, has been using frameworks like theories of change, which are embedded in development, which try and understand what makes long-term change possible and what are the multiple factors leading up to that, because that is the complexity of a place. So just to talk through a couple of these elements, which I think are most important for an inclusive economy approach to COVID recovery and possibly a transformation of our economy if we're being really positive. But certainly to address some of the hardships that are coming. This idea of knowledge and intelligence being a multi-directional thing, and that being very linked to power. So making accessible and visible development timelines, land ownership, community assets and social infrastructure, where and how you can influence development as as a community, and why you should be interested in that. You know, that requires a lot of communications work and kind of stepping back and trying to make really transparent all of the different internal structures and pipework that we work with to enable people to interface with it, so that everyone can share the same facts, you know, something that's really important in this political climate, and have a robust and inclusive discussion about what's really needed, and to be able to participate in any sort of decision making. This also feeds the other way, so the community intelligence, and this plays a bit to what Nabeel was talking about at a local level with local businesses, you know, understanding what people need. So, for example, in developing the economy strategy for the enterprise zone, there were some community-led workshops where people were developing facilitation skills, but having quite, in a safe space, quite deep discussions about how particularly people from Black and Asian communities were seeing barriers to employment and the economy as really being about barriers to civic participation. You know, that the exposure, the confidence to participate, so they're being part of a wider community, and the flexibility of opportunities to fit with lifestyles, family commitments, that type of thing. So having that intelligence flowing across stakeholders is a really important part to enabling a more sensitive, needs-based place development. Also, capacity building has become, and the development of capacities of particularly local civil society and voluntary sector organisations has become very much apparent in current times, but also in order to make full use of the huge investment that is coming into the area. You know, there'll be significant amounts of funding through good growth funding, for example, but for local community organisations who are struggling to survive right now, for them to be part of this innovation, there needs to be some capacity development, some support for them to be able to actually spend this money. There's no point just kind of having it available and assuming good growth will happen. Also, the local civil society would be really important in developing. So I've decided to stop sharing my slides again. Thanks. In developing a response to this huge unemployment challenge, how people can develop transferable skills and remain engaged and with a purpose, building on the outpouring of mutual aid and the efforts by community businesses and people's general involvement in their communities through voluntary sector organisations, who are the first port of call for response to many of the crises we've been seeing. Now, they're going to become an important actor in enabling people to stay active and to develop skills and transfer across different industries. And the social networks and capacities and the value transactions that are happening, that are developing skills, that are enabling people to have a good livelihood, which is really at the core of this inclusive economies debate. You know, those are things that are locally understood and locally defined, and the voluntary sector, the civil society sector, is really key to that. And the point that Chris has picked up in some of his work, and also Nabeel alluded to, is that the part of the economy, this kind of foundational economy that's built around you know, house maintenance, meals out, hospitality, haircuts, that makes up such a huge part of the economy and of jobs, something like 40% in Newham, that this is where innovation needs to happen, actually. So when we think about innovation in the knowledge sector, we need to broaden that approach to innovation as well, to be much more inclusive and to see where the assets currently lie, you know, where there is already a lot of amazing work happening, already innovation happening. Nabeel talked about this very responsive approach and iterating and learning and adapting. You know, that's on the ground is where that's happening. It's not necessarily through big investment in green tech, although that is very important as well. So how do you do both? So I think finally, the decision-making part is really important, and Newham have a democracy commission which is reviewing decision-making structures and how people can participate more in them. The findings of the democracy commission are out on Monday, actually, And current approaches like citizens' assemblies are being tested, but there's a huge history of participatory urban decision-making that's happened in many countries around the world. There's Decide Madrid, Decide Madrid, a digital platform. It's been rolled out through Spain, participatory budgeting happening since the 1970s in Brazil. Lots of different models. So seeing what's right for now and how to help us adapt to the current crisis is really important. So where do community boards or design review panels or young people's participation processes, working with NUM's existing youth empowerment services, have a role to play in deciding, how this very uncertain future is going to unfold. And finally, it's just been really interesting to see some of these models that are being used from the London Prosperity Board and redefining prosperity. A lot of it draws on livelihoods frameworks and asset-based approaches, capacity development approaches used in development work. We're talking a lot about power analysis. The human rights power analysis tools are now being used to develop advocacy strategies for local communities and how they participate in change, and creating political space through the use of civic space and public space and public realm is something that's increasingly important now in how we address racial injustice or how we address exclusion from the civic space. So yeah, those are my reflections, and maybe we can go into a bit of a discussion now.
Wonderful, thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for some really thought-provoking stuff. Right, we want to get some questions in from the audience. There's a few coming in, and we'll also do a quick poll whilst I kind of ask the first question. But I think Chris put out, and we've all spoken about some very interesting models from around the world. So things like the donut economic model, which is being used as the recovery template for Amsterdam, things like gross national happiness. I'd be interested to hear from Chris, what would be the first steps that we could do to implement them in London? And then I think from Nabeel and Sarah, what are the barriers to us achieving that as a starting point? And I'll just get this poll going, which might make your screen go back. So Chris, do you want to take that one to start with?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't think it's that difficult, really. It's kind of just us all resetting our brains a little bit and accepting that there is a different way of doing things, and there's a different way of measuring things. These things are all, I mean, we've done 2 pieces of work for the GLA in the last couple of years. One is to develop a measurement framework for the Good Growth Fund, and the most recent one has been to develop a toolkit for measuring social integration. This enables us to collect all of this information to do this, and the Prosperity Board adds another level of sort of depth to that. The challenge is just getting us to a point where we accept that these are the preeminent measures of economic success and are prepared to sort of back ourselves to do that. And other than that, I don't think it's that difficult. But I do appreciate, having tested this out in NUM and in other authorities, and actually tested it out with developers and investors as well, I do understand that changing that mindset can be difficult.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Nabeel, it'd be interesting to see your response. One question which kind of followed up is, do you think you have the toolbox and the powers to really make that sort of change? I'll just close the poll and share it, which shows actually the majority of the audience, perhaps unsurprisingly, 60% think well-being and happiness is the most important thing that we should be measuring. As a Nabeel.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the audience there. Do we have the toolbox and the powers? Frankly, no, we don't. No, I think it's interesting that all the models or all the examples that Chris has sort of pointed to, they've been overseas models. Here in the UK, we are one of the most centralized democracies in the world, and until that changes, until there is more devolution to regions and to local authorities, I hate to be the sort of doomsayer in this, but I just can't see how we can start to shift our sort of economic modelling to be more focused around health and well-being. As much as I'm the biggest supporter of that, and I think everything that donut economics is sort of proposing and what Amsterdam is trying to do is exactly the right kind of stuff we should be aiming towards. yeah, for me, I can't see how we can do that in practice at a local authority level. Happy to be challenged and happy to sort of explain why I don't think that is. I think until we get more devolution, that will help. Funding devolution, particularly fiscal devolution, but also also more powers directly to us. I think what we've seen during the sort of health emergency is that local authorities are far better placed to respond to local emergencies. I mean, it's been really interesting for us, the local authorities, to watch what's been happening with Leicester over the weekend. The lack of data that was made available, the lack of the fact the mayor of Leicester was told over the weekend, early in the morning, that the city was going to go down into lockdown. That just goes to show you. And then, by the way, Leicester City Council were then responsible for putting the outbreak control plans in action. That just goes to show you how can we start to even think about moving our economic model when we're working in such a centralised state. So, sorry to be a doomsayer, but I think we need more devolution before we can do that.
And Sarah, I guess from a kind of a mayoral perspective and your reality actually on the ground in the Royal Docks, I mean, how are you perceiving it, particularly as a lot of the land deals have been done, a lot of the deals have been taken forward. So there's only so much you can do to kind of really kind of capitalise on the growth of the social good.
Yeah, there are a lot of stakeholders involved. So local authority, but also large businesses and anchor institutions, and the landholders. So there's London City Airport, there's Tate and Lyle, there's Excel, there's Bühler, huge food and tech solution company. There's Rodmer, control the water, and having all of these stakeholders sign up to an alternative metric for measuring growth is really challenging, but I think it's not impossible. It's a particular environment in the Royal Docks in that this collaborative approach of all these stakeholders with varying degrees of power actually kind of provides a bit of an opportunity. So if you can develop this, get everyone on board with a narrative around purpose-driven investment, that can only become real if it has metrics and accountability attached to it. So who is holding people to account becomes the question. And also having some kind of, you have say a microeconomic approach where, for example, the London Prosperity Board initiative, where people kind of redefine social value in their neighbourhoods, has to kind of play in with a macroeconomic analysis of how does that actually change people's capacities to get the jobs that we need them to have in order to make certain industries thrive. And for everyone to, and for those sets to come together is really hard, but I think that's somehow where the answer lies. And then and then the accountability, which is who has the where's the legislation, or where's the kind of impetus to do this or not do this.
The planning system is really important for this, because the planning system is where you can enforce and you can change things. But Nabeel's absolutely right. If you've cut local government 60%, then you can't do a lot of this. You can't actually do a lot of the things that Sarah's talked about in terms of civic engagement and civic society, because you need a strong local government to enable these things to happen. So, I mean,
and I think the data came out, I think, recently showing that spending is down by, I think it's like 20% of what it was 10 years ago on the planning and kind of regeneration departments. So as you might expect with an audience of planners, there are a lot of questions coming in on actually what the planning system should do. I think I'll start just by, it'd be interesting to hear each of your perspectives on whether some of the announcements on the biggest planning reform since the Second World War that was announced earlier this week, whether you think that any of that is helpful in terms of our recovery, particularly I think around the kind of the permitted development rights and the ability, particularly on our high streets, to change easily change land uses. Chris and then Nabeel, be interesting to hear both your perspectives on that.
Permitted development specifically?
Well, and everything else, I think, but permitted development is probably one of the quick wins. I think that's kind of what they were looking at this week. The more wholesale change is going to take much longer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's bullshit, to be honest. I mean,
English, Chris.
yeah, sorry, but no.
I think that you're probably sharing.
Yeah, okay. The high street needs to change, and you know, there's loads of interesting. So we've done lots of interesting work and research on high streets, and I think if you think differently about high streets at civic spaces, lots of incredible, exciting things you can do. This idea, this you know, retail to resi conversions, all you're doing is probably creating lower quality housing for people to live in. You know, it runs completely contrary to what I was talking about earlier in terms of creating secure livelihoods, in terms of creating a minimum standard of living. So it potentially becomes more divisive in terms of inequality, contributes to all sorts of issues around the way that town centres will need to operate and be serviced. So, you know, it's just storing up a lot of problems for the future. And I think, you know, if the amount of time, effort and money that will be spent either implementing, challenging or dealing with the impacts of that was spent on thinking more broadly and in a more progressive way about the economy, we'd probably be a lot better off.
And Nabeel, I mean, with a lot of people now, you know, particularly in London, strikes me some of the high streets, so we're talking about Norwood High Street, for example, earlier, might actually do better because there's actually more people working at home during the day. Is that something that you see, and do the government announcements help you, do you think, from a local authority perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the fast data that we keep an eye on is certainly evidencing that playing out. So we're expecting the central London economy to initially be slower to recover, but then eventually the central London economy will recover better than the outer London town centres and high streets. But at the moment, if I look at footfall numbers in, say, Vauxhall and compare it to Streatham and Norwood are about 60% to what they were pre-COVID, compared to about 30% in the north of the borough. So there is certainly something happening in the outer London town centres around more footfall. It's interesting. So my team are currently as we speak, deciphering the business and planning bill and trying to put in sort of new systems around licensing and permits, and you know, all the back office stuff that we need to have in place once this bill receives royal assent. And I mean, it's interesting. So I mean, on the plus side, it allows us to, or it forces us to be far more responsive and start, you know, where we were taking 28 days to determine an outdoor table license chair application, for example, we have to do it within 10 days. Otherwise, it's granted automatically. So it forces us within the local authorities to be much more on the button about this. So that's a good thing, in that it forces us to sort of respond. The bad thing is that they've capped, the government have, in their wisdom, capped the sort of permit fees to £100. So it actually costs us more at the moment when you take it into the round to assess an application and issue it than it does to you know, than £100. So yet again, it's yet another funding gap that we're having to fill, which then means that we're going to have to start making some considerations around what our budgets are going to look like for next year and the year after. And going back to Chris's point, unfortunately, it's going to be the discretionary services, so areas like mine, that get the hit. So it's going to be regeneration, it's going to be economic development, those kind of areas that get cut, because we can't cut social care services for obvious reasons. So to back up Chris's point, some of it is short-termist, and yes, will help some businesses, even though there are trade-offs with some of our residents. But actually, in the long term, it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us because it just means we're further exacerbating the funding issue that we have.
Great. And so we're, as an industry, we're expecting, as I said, significant reform, primary legislative reform coming probably in the autumn. The RTPI this week, hopefully everyone's seen the Plan the World, the new campaign that RTPI set out. What one message would you kind of give to government? What one mechanism would you like to see coming forward to amend the planning system to create more inclusive growth? We'll start with Sarah on that.
Okay, well, not really my area of speciality, but I think from what I've seen in Newham and the rates of homelessness and unstable housing being so interlinked with poverty and health and ability of people to contribute to, you know, growing the economy, a kind of completely different approach to affordable housing, drawing from European models where the state plays a much more active role as a provider of genuinely affordable housing that takes on some of the risks and that also includes devolution to local areas who have much more knowledge about what is needed in terms of provision and where and how.
Great. Chris?
I'd probably go one step further than that, and I think legislation to enable local authorities to build, actually have a proper long-term program. It's not going to happen, but a proper long-term program of public sector house building would be, a sensible approach out of a crisis. Because if nothing else, it keeps more money within local authorities within a local area.
Great, thanks. And Nabeel, what's your take?
Can I finish with an aspirational point? Sorry to detach myself from reality. What I'd really like the government to bring forward is a land value tax. That's what I'd really like the government to bring forward. I think that would be a genuinely progressive taxation system that can potentially start to address some of the the things that we don't like about our planning system at the moment, and how the system can be gamed. That's what I would genuinely like, but that's not going to happen either. But one can dream, right?
Absolutely. I need to think a bit more about that, but well, I would say start by recognising the need for planning and the need for planners and well-resourced local authorities to do that. I mean, that's the fundamental thing. But actually, giving a plug to I've got the words right now, the plan, the world we need research, which the RTPI set out this week, which I think actually is starting to kind of make the case. And it feels like as a profession, we all need to be starting to kind of get and start making the case very strongly for what we do and the need for and the importance of what we do. But I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us this afternoon. Please tell us what you thought of the event. We welcome feedback. There's been lots of questions, and what we've been doing for the ones that we haven't been able to ask, we've been circulating them amongst the speakers to be responded to. So we'll email that out later on. Make sure you're subscribed to the RTPI's YouTube channel, where this and other events from the Planner Live can be found, as well as the past RTPI London events that we've been running over the past few weeks have been going on as part of the Ideas Exchange. And I'd also just like to give a plug. Next week, we're teaming up with Public Practice to continue the conversation around where we need to be going in London, with a particular focus on how local authorities in particular need to be skilling up and resourcing up to deal with the oncoming crisis. So we'll be no doubt continuing the conversation again. So normally we'd have a round of applause for each of our speakers. We can't do that. We're just going to switch you off. But anyway, thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining, and have a good weekend. Super Saturday.